I'm Roberto Baldwin, and this is Tomorrow Today's Sustainable Mobility Brief. The transportation world is evolving at a rate not seen in decades. The transition from fossil fuels to sustainable energy has brought with it some truly exciting opportunities, but also some confusion. I'll sift through the noise and share quick updates on the latest news, trends, and advancements that will impact our world for years to come. This week on the Tomorrow Today Briefs podcast, we have YUNEV Principal Consultant Kevin Beaty. Kevin, thank you so much for being with us today. You have a pretty extensive resume, experience, life lessons in the world of electrification and batteries. And while, EVs and battery technology might seem relatively new to the average observer, you've actually been in this world for over 20 years. So let's talk about the early days, things when most people weren't really thinking about an electric vehicle.
That's right. Thanks, Roberto. Thank you for having me on the show today. I'm really grateful to be here. My e-mobility background began almost 25 years ago when I was recruited to lead Eaton Corporation's startup in the hybrid electric space in very early 2000. And one of the first decisions we made was to choose lithium-ion batteries over nickel metal hydride or advanced lead acid, which were more popular, more common at the time. There were a couple of outcomes from that decision. One, we had much better product and performance characteristics, but we had far fewer suppliers to choose from. So we ended up in a sole source relationship with an excellent Japanese partner and supplier for the next 10 years. And it wasn't until about that time, 10 years later, that we brought on some additional sources in South Korea, in China, and in the U.S. And I must say, my experience is informed by a lot of scar tissue because during those 10 years, we had forecasting errors in both directions. We over-forecasted, we under-forecasted, and when we over-forecasted and we were wrong, we were sitting on a mountain of inventory. When we under-forecasted, we blew through the inventory, blew through everything our supplier could get to us, and then we were causing stockouts and production stoppage at the truck OEMs during 2009 when they were trying to bring back workers and recover from the Great Recession. So a lot of those experiences have really informed and also impressed on me just how tough this industry is to work through. And one of the things we did was every 3 or 4 years, we did a rigorous global sourcing study, and we scanned the globe, put people on planes, spent a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources. And over that period of time, it became more and more clear to me how quickly the Chinese battery industry was advancing during the late 2000s, the early 2010s, largely as a result of Deng Xiaoping's 863 program, which many people had not or probably have never heard of. But going back to March of 1986, that's when China really began the journey that has gotten them to where they are today. And as a result of all that rapid progress, my wife and I ended up moving to China, spent 2 years immersing ourselves in culture and language and building out my professional network there. And so for the past decade, YUNEV has been working to build better battery supply chains with cell suppliers, with OEMs, with tier 1 suppliers, et cetera. So that's my background in a nutshell.
It's interesting you talk about supply issues like with lithium ion, which, we have supply issues now, but there was nothing before this. And you sort of had to create that.
Well, there was very, very little. And so you had to go find it, and you had to talk the supplier into working with you because they had very limited capacity and they had to choose their horses or their partners and their go-to-market strategy very carefully.
And so during those, these past 20 years, what has surprised you most in the battery world? What do you feel like has been the huge, surprising takeaway that maybe you didn't anticipate when you started?
Well, what did not surprise me was China's significant lead in this space. That we saw that coming 15 years ago, maybe even longer. But I think one of the biggest surprises is just the dramatic order of magnitude price reduction, cost reduction for lithium batteries during the 2010s. I've told people many times that if Eaton had known that battery prices were going to fall as dramatically as they would through the 2010s, there probably would have been second thoughts going into whether or not to exit the hybrid business during the early mid 2010s. It just was inconceivable that the pricing could come down as dramatically as it has. So that's one big surprise to me. Another one is just then the corresponding scale and the breadth that the industry's built out. Over 2 terawatt hours of capacity last year across the globe, maybe 80% of that in China. And with all that capacity and with all that growth, there are still some segments that haven't had traction as much as I would have expected, like home backup power to eliminate generators and the like. Another one is just how slow the industry has moved towards standardization. It's always hard. SAE is a leader in this space, and it just takes a lot of time and a lot of work and a lot of coordination to get standards in place. But it's really quite dizzying to think about the array of chemistries, the form factors, the specifications, significantly varying cycle life, warranties, technical standards. In our database, we have over 50 technical standards for batteries that are cited as certifications for battery cells in our database from over 20 governing bodies around the world. And then so many, multiple terminal configurations and multiple techniques for connecting to those terminations. And that's just a few of today's mainstream technologies. Then we have semi-solid state, all solid state, sodium ion, and other technologies in the pipeline. So this wide range of options and lack of standardization puts a lot of pressure on systems architects and design engineers when they're trying to make the right decisions that are really going to set the stage for success or failure of their products going forward. And a lot of examples of major global OEMs walking away from multi-billion-dollar investments just because they realized, that really wasn't the form factor, that really wasn't the chemistry, or that really wasn't the supplier strategy. So these are high-stakes games, and I think it's exciting to see how design engineers and systems engineers are really right in the middle of it, making really important decisions.
Do you foresee a time in the future where there are more standards? There are this is how you make an LFP battery, and this is how you make a lithium-ion battery, and this is just for the sake of making things a bit easier for everyone involved? Or is it just too much?
I'd like to think it could get simpler, but I actually think the complexity could continue to proliferate in the next 5 to 10 years, to be honest. We have cells in our database, from a few amp hours or even fractional amp hour capacity to over 300 and well beyond, just in terms of capacity. And then, as I mentioned, all the other variety of chemistries and form factors. And when you think about the use cases, there are reasons for having those different cells and form factors and chemistries. And so it just really raises the stakes for sourcing teams, strategic planning, product designers, product planners to really be informed and make factor-based decisions as much as possible.
And you said you spent some time in China, and we hear on the regular that China's tech is nearly a decade ahead of the United States and Europe. So is that true? And how do they perceive themselves in China?
Well, it's certainly true that they're far ahead. I think there are a lot of ways to address this or talk about it. And certainly on the production floor and across the entire supply chain ecosystem, they are light years ahead in one respect. I mean, probably a decade. That kind of terminology gets used a lot, and I tend to agree with it. I have heard from others at SAE that a survey was done recently talking about, or actually just gaining insight into a perspective within China among engineers in this industry that they are not as far ahead as they think they should be or could be or would like to be. And I think that kind of sentiment is surprising for some of us on this side of the pond, looking at their dominant position. And, I've talked to colleagues over there about what might explain that. They remind me that there's still a long way to go on new energy vehicles. In their view, the pursuit of excellence and innovation never ends. And it's worth noting from their view that most Chinese new energy vehicle and battery manufacturers have not yet achieved significant profitability. And so when they look at Tesla as a benchmark, they feel like they're not yet there, ironically. So that fundamental economic fact could explain a view that they're not as far ahead. As a friend of mine recently told me, he said, I think China is indeed leading this industry, but this is just the first 50 meters of a 1,000-meter race. So there's still many unknowns to come. So they do have a long view perspective, and I think that gives them a sense of soberness about their current position and whether they can continue to extend it or whether it will begin to erode.
And what do you think for companies outside of China? Like, what do they need to catch up? How do they, the battery manufacturers specifically, like what needs to happen within those companies in order for this to continue?
I think the first place to start is to resist the temptation to blame subsidies for China's meteoric rise in the EV and automotive space in general. That narrative is very strong in the US and in Europe and in Canada and really across the West. And it's just an extremely unhelpful narrative because it masks the reality that what's really gotten China where they are is the speed and the rate at which and just the degree to which they are innovating and bringing new technology in low-cost engineered solutions. It's not just that they're being subsidized. There's not an EV vehicle plant or battery plant that I'm aware of any consequence in North America or Europe that doesn't have significant subsidies. I mean, billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars. So I'm always curious when people complain about the subsidies that the Chinese must have, and yet even the Chinese are getting subsidies for their plants in North America and in Europe. So I just don't get the emphasis. I don't think it's helpful. I think that the real challenge is around innovating and getting more elegant solutions, cost-effective solutions, and specifically regarding battery manufacturers in the West. I think they need to be looking to partner with Chinese companies in smart ways that give the Chinese access to growth markets. One of the key challenges facing the Chinese battery makers and EV makers right now is they've achieved 50% penetration in the largest automotive market in the world. So their growth rate is starting to slow down, and they're looking abroad to solve that challenge and to continue fueling their growth. And basically, there's a big opportunity for Western battery makers to partner with the Chinese, give them access to their home markets while coming up to speed on state-of-the-art technologies, manufacturing techniques, supply chain management practices, all of which we need to get up to speed on very, very quickly.
Do you think it's maybe a I don't want to say lack of focus, but dedication to focus that's sort of pushed some of these companies seem a little bit off course when it comes to battery manufacturing?
That's not my sense. No, I think that those in the West that are either making batteries or making EVs are all in. It's just that the pressure to close the gap on the timeline and close the gap on the cost footprint is just an enormous challenge.
And so, we're in this really exciting and confusing. It's confusing not just for like the average person, for people in the industry, really. Time and transportation. How does your company, YUNEV, help people and companies navigate everything that's happening?
Well, we don't help everybody with everything, but we do have two lanes of business, okay? We're a small shop. We have two primary lanes of business. One is we provide strategic planning and advisory services to clients by leveraging almost 4 decades of experience commercializing advanced propulsion and powertrain technologies. And our expertise is especially in the commercial vehicle space, trucks, buses, etc., what I call the long tail compared to the global pass car OEMs. And we play a very important role of simultaneously grounding clients in the art of what's possible and reminding them, look, that's not going to happen, while at the same time really challenging them to look at things with a fresh perspective and be be willing to entertain some very creative, non-traditional, maybe non-conventional approaches. And as a result, we tend to unlock some very high ROI for our clients and partners in this space by joining their teams and contributing that fresh perspective that is very grounded on a lot of, several decades of hard-earned experience. The other thing we do is we leverage a very deep data set on battery cells, battery cells. So we've got over or close to 1,000 battery cells in our database. And so we're able to conduct very fast, very quick searches for clients based on a range of parameters: cell supplier, cell chemistry, cell form factor, cell specifications, cycle life, C rates, just a number of parameters to move very quickly through the early identification. We have, on more than one occasion, we've had clients come to us and ask us to help qualify or validate or even negotiate with a prospective new supplier. And often they say, hey, they're producing the only cell with this specification, which always perks up our ears because it's very uncommon that anyone's producing a cell that is truly one of a kind, especially if that supplier is located in China. So we routinely push back on clients and help educate them on the reality that often, if not always, there are 2, 3, 4, 5 other suppliers producing a very, very similar cell. And that's one of, I think, the key areas where we serve the industry is by emphasizing the critical importance of creating a dual source for all battery cell specifications or cell supply scenarios and battery scenarios. We often hear smaller OEMs and smaller tier ones and startups tell us they can't afford to bring on a secondary source. It's just too expensive. And while we recognize there is additional cost and resources required to do that work, our response is always the same, and it is, you cannot afford not to bring on a secondary source. So as a result, one of our practice areas is helping clients build and execute plans that reduce the cost of bringing on that secondary source. But it just needs to be a discipline that companies plan for, budget for, resource for, and recognize as a bit of a non-negotiable, frankly, going into these programs. Otherwise, they're just putting their company and their products and really their customers at undue risk.
I think this is really highlighted during the in the past few years with the supply chain issues, where even major OEMs had a single source for, say, one part. And a car is only as fast in production as the slowest piece, the slowest supplier.
Exactly. You saw that during COVID where, some of the Detroit 3 were shipping product with features disabled until they could get one chip. And then they would get that to the dealer and have it upfitted, or even have the customer bring that vehicle back in. Now, that's a really, by the way, really agile, smart way of handling that kind of a supply chain situation. So I think those who were in that situation should be commended for not holding up delivery of the vehicle for a single component or feature. And yet, you're right, it underlines how critical having dual source, secondary source. Toyota is probably one of the most disciplined automakers in the world on this point. And it's easy to rationalize it away, but it's always a mistake, in my opinion.
So what is the biggest obstacle that battery manufacturers face in the world today? What are some things that group needs to really be thinking about?
So I think to answer that, we need to group the battery manufacturers into 3 segments in my mind. You've got the Chinese manufacturers, you have the Southeast Asia, or I'll say South Korea and Japan, and then you've got kind of the rest of the world, the West. In this case, India's just coming online, so I'm going to kind of pretend that India has not yet gone all in on batteries, but they are emerging as I think they will emerge as a big player here. But at the moment, the Chinese are facing a serious challenge of slowed growth. They've not fully saturated the market, but they've penetrated their market to a very high degree. and the growth rate prospects domestically are reducing. So they're looking abroad. The problem is they face major headwinds, mostly in the form of tariffs, but sometimes regulatory barriers. And so that's a big challenge for them to face, especially in the EU, in the US, and in Canada. If you think about South Korea and maybe some of the Japanese battery manufacturers, their challenge is to grab and secure and try to retain as many global OEM customers as possible before the Chinese begin to conquest. And much of that conquest could come in the form of partnerships like the CATL or CATL partnership with Ford on the Blue Oval plant in Michigan and others like that. And then third, in the EU and the US, those battery makers are facing an enormous competitive disadvantage in terms of capital cost, operating cost, production yields, ultimately cost of goods, and the resulting price point that related to trying to produce batteries that will compete with the Chinese sources. So, and I'll just emphasize my point earlier, even if you take subsidies in China away from the equation, it's still not even close in terms of cost competitiveness between the Chinese and the Western. So I don't know why this narrative gets so much traction, except it's just popular and it's easy to talk about and you don't have to do a lot of homework. But at the end of the day, if you take the subsidies away, the U.S. and Europe are still losing at such a distance, it isn't even close. So in my opinion, if you think about what these companies need to be doing, I would say they need to be thinking about and actually working very, very hard, both strategically and proactively, to build win-win partnerships with Chinese manufacturers where there's a good market and cultural fit between the companies. And YUNEV and companies like us are available to help OEMs and Tier 1s develop and execute those breakthrough strategies in this area. So I think folks have just got to do more work on the front end, try to get out ahead of this, be more strategic, more proactive, and build longer-term solutions. Because in the short term, there's just not a lot of good news out there, unfortunately. And the tariffs are just a very temporary, partial, incomplete, insufficient, unacceptable Band-Aid.
You talked a little bit about India. What do you see coming out of India in the next 5-10 years?
That's a great question. I think you'll see some major global gigafactories established on the battery side there. I think those factories will enjoy less political resistance depending on the end market, but certainly they would, at least on paper today, they'd probably have fewer tariffs or be less political headwind on entering the U.S. market. They should enjoy a very attractive cost structure. I think the question, though, there've just been some strange announcements. I know BYD had a major plant planned and even plans announced for India, and then that approval for that plant was not fulfilled or received or obtained. So I'm sure there is a lot of gamemanship going on in terms of India's strategy on how to position and capitalize on some of these opportunities, because we're not in a comfortable, happy place worldwide on battery supply. And so India has got tremendous resources with regards to labor, land, buildings, infrastructure, et cetera, that they could tap into and emerge as a pretty serious player.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, there's not that political concern that we have especially in the United States and EU with China, that we wouldn't have that with India.
Not today, anyway.
Not today. We'll see how it shakes out once there's a lot of Indian batteries on the market. With your broad perspective, what should the battery engineers understand about what's going on in terms of sourcing new developments like chemistries, et cetera?
My message to battery engineers would be really work as closely and as early as possible with your supply chain and your sourcing colleagues to take into consideration who are you going, picture yourself beyond the product development process and the product validation process and the SOP. Picture yourself post-SOP, you're in production, now you're sourcing these batteries on a just-in-time basis. How's that going for you? you're 3 months in, you're 6 months in, you're 9 months in. Is it smooth? Is it predictable? Are things going well? Or are you starting to see signs that you're not their number one customer, you're not their number one priority? How do you resolve issues like that? A lot of those are very predictable issues. And we've seen a number of clients and peers, colleagues across the industry have complete loss of supply. And, to hear them tell it, they got an email after the last container was loaded on a ship that battery cell had been discontinued, and therefore it came as a shock. Well, there are very simple techniques that can be deployed, very low cost, consistent, predictable techniques to get visibility to those kinds of events 3 months, 6 months, 9 months in advance, even in China. So the fact that they were surprised just means they really weren't doing their homework. They weren't paying attention to their supply chain management priorities, and things were going along just fine, and they basically were duped into a false sense of security. A lot of these things need to be thought about right up front during the cell selection process. So clearly at the major global OEMs, this happens, the big three in Detroit, in Europe, Japan, etc. But when you get down to the longer tail, lower volume OEMs and some of the tier ones, system partners in that space, things are done on a little bit more expeditious basis, and I'm not so sure that supply chain and strategic sourcing have as strong a weigh-in and strong a factor during the early chemistry, form factor, cell selection, supplier selection process where they should have. And so that's where industry experts like YUNEV and others can come in and bring a fresh eyes perspective combined with deep industry knowledge and experience and really help de-risk those programs significantly from the earliest stage of new product development.
Yeah, that's very interesting. When I talk to engineers, I talk to people in the industry about, battery, and very few of them have ever said, I'm really thinking about the sourcing of the battery that I'm designing, or the pack. I don't think I've ever had one of the persons who's like, yeah, I'm designing the pack and we had this and we did this and we did this. It's never like, we had the pack and we had to make sure that the cylinders that we're getting are still available. We have to make sure those are available for 3 to 4 years, at least up until, a mid-cycle refresh.
Right. I mean, 20, 25 years ago or longer, we were talking about simultaneous engineering, and we were trying to, create systematic processes around getting supply chain and sourcing involved earlier in the process, and all the key stakeholders having to sign off at gate 0, gate 1, gate 2, et cetera. Those kinds of disciplines help encourage this to happen. But I think even the design engineers themselves should really, even if they've got a great supplier, if they don't know who the secondary source is for that cell, for that design, they should just not be sleeping well. They should just be looking. Surely there's somebody else out there with secondary source, and there definitely is. So if you can't find them easily, call us, call someone else. It's very easy to address. Just needs some effort, some time, and attention.
And you talked about your database. You have a pretty extensive, research tracking of about 90% of the battery cells out there on the market. I think you explained a little bit. Can you explain how that benefits the broader industry?
Yeah, our battery cell database does make it possible for us to do these searches very quickly and efficiently, leveraging almost 1,000 power battery cells, mostly for EV and other e-mobility applications. So if a client wants to search, maybe they do have a preferred supplier, that's fine. We're not against preferred suppliers. If you've got a great relationship, then we can just search within their system. Ironically, some of their own staff don't know what other battery cells they're making, believe it or not. I won't say who, can't say who, but I was with one of the, I'll just say top 5 suppliers earlier this year, and I was surprised even this year to learn that they've got among 3 families of battery cells. Those teams don't even know what the other battery cell folks are doing inside their own organization just due to normal silos and normal organizational boundaries. It's not malicious or intentional, it just happens. And so we can search by cell supplier, by chemistry, capacity, form factor, cycle life, dimensional size, charge and discharge C rates, and more. We're working to make that database even more widely available to CTOs, chief engineers, design engineers, sourcing teams, researchers, and others. Because ultimately, this kind of information just enables much more informed, much more data-driven decisions to be made, and it de-risks the entire development and production cycle process.
I do remember, OEMs a couple of years ago, they were supposed, one OEM particularly was supposed to bring a vehicle to the United States, and they canceled it because we can't get enough batteries. And I'm curious, what the, if it was it a sourcing issue, was it just, it was early days, but it seems like, with this database, if that were to happen now, they could be like, well, we're getting it from this source, but we can find there's a second source. There's also a third source. And they'd be able to find that quickly with the YUNEV's database.
Exactly. And even with an existing design, we can quickly identify alternatives for a secondary source. Many folks are sole source today. A lot of times there's just this escalation of commitment around the cell supplier that was chosen. And so there's this narrative internally about how, well, they're really the only ones we can trust. They've supported us so far. And that's great. I tell everyone in that situation, you should go to bed tonight thankful for your happy situation. And you should get up tomorrow morning and work hard to protect that with a secondary source. I mean, you shouldn't wait until day after tomorrow. You've got to get on this. And so identifying secondary sources. Others use it for competitive purposes. We've shown it to cell suppliers, and they light up like, oh, I could actually look and see what my competitor's doing, or see if there are how many other cells are close to mine in the market, and think about pricing strategy or ongoing product roadmap planning, et cetera. So, yeah, we're big fans of getting as much fact-based, data-driven decision-making as possible, especially when the stakes are as high as they are with batteries and cells occupying such a dominant position on the bill of materials for these products.
And so what's your general advice for entrepreneurs who are entering the mobility space? The Lucids before they're a Lucid, the Rivians before they're a Rivian, those early days entrepreneurs.
Yeah, just the word entrepreneur is a bit problematic because it means sometimes something so rich for many of us, and for others it might be slightly different. But in my experience, I would say if you're in the automotive industry and you are an entrepreneur, if that is truly your personality type, your DNA, I would say, you're in for a bit of a love-hate dynamic in my experience. CEOs, business owners, some senior leaders will appreciate the creativity, the innovation, the entrepreneurial-minded behavior that you bring to your organization. But that behavior brings change. And change and disruption are not welcome by the majority of people in the organization, unfortunately. And even in the marketplace, those kinds of changes are not always welcome. I mean, you can look at the split in terms of perception of EVs in Europe and in the U.S. today. We're not there yet. And so that, I think, the one advice I would say is just give yourself permission and make a commitment to self-reflection and renewal to protect you against the burnout and just against the ability to persist in the face of chronic pushback, chronic resistance that just will not go away. And, if you've got an entrepreneurial DNA genetic structure, then, embrace that. And find other like-minded people in your organization or outside your organization that can remind you that you're not strange, you're just different. And, you've got a very important, valuable role to bring to your organization and to the industry. And you need to go for it and embrace it. And don't let, other voices squelch you or discourage you or cause you to kind of go with the flow, because that is just not how we progress.
It's interesting because I've talked to a bunch of people who've been in the industry in the mobility, the sustainable mobility industry for decades, and their advice is essentially be very flexible, be ready to move, be ready for changes, be ready for this, and be ready for, if you're at a place with like the rigidity of the organization is just so much that you can't make the changes, you might have to go somewhere else. So I think it's very much part of that DNA to just be extremely flexible and ready to change and ready to, like I say, self-reflection in order to keep going.
That's a great point, Roberto. So if you're in an organization that's not that receptive, not that entrepreneurial, it's going to take a lot of time and you're going to have to persist. And if that's what you feel called to do, just make sure you don't get burned out and give up in the process. But as you say, if the organization isn't going to move as quickly as you need it to, and this is not your jam, and you need to be free to fly, then I would say that's absolutely great advice. Get out and find a place where there's more fertile soil and, more conducive conditions for you to really contribute and make a difference. But what you don't want to do is just kind of compromise and start to blend in. And that is a tempting path. And it's one that should be resisted against all other external forces.
And one of the things I keep hearing about is the automakers are slowing down, the slowdown of EV rollouts. And it's to me it's kind of an annoying news item. But what do you tell these entrepreneurs or to people who want to go into an industry when they see the news about automakers slowing down their EV rollouts?
Yeah, the key is slowing down. They're not stopping. They're not no longer moving forward. They're just slowing down the rate of growth. And there was a very emotional article by one of the industry cheerleaders about a week or two ago that we shared in our weekly headline roll up, because while I didn't entirely agree with it, I felt like, this voice needs to be heard. They were so frustrated with all this talk about the slowdown. They're like, it's not slowing down. People are still growing. Well, yes, but the growth rate is slowing down and people are pulling back and laying off and not moving forward with plants. And so when you're reading that information, I think it's important to maintain a perspective that, we're at an unprecedented or at a time during an unprecedented industry transition toward electrification. That is not going to change. I just can't imagine that it's going to change. I think in a way it's good that the growth rate is slowing down because we're getting back to something that's more sustainable growth rate from my personal view. I think this is the most important and exciting time to be working in this industry, certainly from my almost 40-year experience looking back. And I think that this is just a rare opportunity to be working the industry at this time. And in my experience, a true recession or a true pullback, slowdown, has been very, very rare and not likely what we're looking at. But the work needs to be thoughtful. We've got an entire fossil fuel complex that fuels the majority of our cars today, and trucks especially, and larger vehicles, construction, ag, you name it. And we need to be charting really smart transitions over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, rather than thinking we're going to get it all done in 5 years. And by 2030, we're going to have no more fossil fuel. That's a bridge too far, frankly. And I think folks are beginning to recognize that after a lot of enthusiastic spending and resource deployment. And I'm sure we're going to get back onto a path that's a little more measured, a little more rational, a little more sustainable. But in the end, we've got to keep pressing on with cleaner energy sources for transportation and mobility.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. What is something you'd like our listeners to take away from today's discussion? Like, what's the big main takeaway for people who are listening in?
I think, as we've talked about having this conversation, I'm just reminded that we are in the midst of this historic transition to e-mobility. And you just think about the breadth across all platforms, products, verticals, segments, applications, and the rate of change and the scale of change. It's unprecedented. It's very disruptive, at least certainly throughout my almost 40-year career, and it creates a lot of pain and a lot of opportunities. So my advice is, for all of us to focus on reducing the pain of others where we can and seize those opportunities that are most attractive to us. And I think we're going to love where we find ourselves in 5-10 years.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Roberto.
Be sure to join us next week when Grayson Brolte will be back with a discussion on commercial fleet electrification and the competitive arena of EV charging infrastructure. Be sure to subscribe and listen every week on your favorite podcast platform.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.